Hi, I'm Nisa Mudley. Some of you may know me from the Personal Finance Money Sense newsletters. You get new news in your inbox once a week. If you don't, please sign up. But this morning I'm wearing a business hat and chatting to three of our very illustrious speakers, and we're talking about the elections and from a business and investor point of view. So I think it was earlier this week that the finance minister tried to tell us that we don't have a debt problem, we have a growth problem. And fair enough, there is a growth problem in South Africa, but it kind of sounded to me like the person who says, I don't have a spending problem, I have an income problem. And then let's just jump straight into it. Iraj, can you, as an economist, set the scene for us and tell us why elections give economists the heebie-jeebies?
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for invitation and greetings to everybody. Economists, like most business people, are concerned about business, concerned about the impact of elections and politics on their businesses, on their investment plans, and so on and so forth, and the regulatory environment within which the incoming government is going to affect their business. Economy does not operate in vacuum. It requires at least two very important complementary solid foundations. One is the regulatory environment within which businesses and different sectors have to operate, and at the same time it requires another important complementary pillar, and that is a political system that is attuned to the needs of the economy. You mentioned the Minister of Finance waking up and saying after 12 years, we need growth. Duh, as the young generation would say. Where have you been since 2008, 9? This economy has been growing from 4.5% all the way consistently down to now. We sort of celebrate if growth is 0.5%, and we get it wrong. Now, under no other than the mismanagement of the government. So who comes to government is very important. What's their understanding and their role with respect to the environment is absolutely critical. And this year, particularly in South Africa, elections are kind of no longer a mock or play elections. Remember, up to now, all our national elections were play elections. We knew the outcome. We knew who the president is going to be. We knew which party is going to dominate the parliament and so on. So it was really a mock election. We were practicing how to participate and how to read the numbers. This year, for the first time, there is an off chance that at the national level there may be some real outcome that we don't know, and uncertainty and unknowns are not good for the business environment, for the economic environment. And of course, at the provincial level, it's almost certain, if you believe the pundits and the pollsters, that we're going to have meaningful, unknown outcome of the elections, with some potentially consequential for the stability and security. So all of those matters for economists and for business people.
And then the RMBB, our confidence index, the business confidence index, showed a decrease in the first quarter of this year, after another 2% decrease in the last quarter of last year. So, Anne, what are your thoughts around the current levels of business confidence and uncertainty?
Well, I think it's important to step back and look at the big picture. We live in a country today where the leading chief executives of our biggest companies have had to stop what they're doing in order to work with the president and the top ministers to help them govern the country. So that's what the business work streams with the president are all about. Kind of emergency repairmen coming in to help a government that can't produce enough energy, that can't run the ports or the railways, and certainly can't deal with crime, or doesn't want to deal with crime. So this is the real picture of where South Africa is, and we're in deep, deep trouble. And I don't say that because I'm a pessimist, but because I think it's vitally important that we understand where the country is, we diagnose why we're in such a terrible position, and then we can start talking about how we move forward. But if you dismiss the causes of South Africa's crisis, you are going to get the solution wrong. So when the president says 9 wasted years, as though he weren't standing right next to President Zuma, and he ignores what he's done to compound some of these crises. Yes, he's introduced some reforms very slowly, but he's done other things as well. So you have to be honest and accurate in the diagnosis of why South Africa is in this situation. And so when you ask about business confidence, the truth is we're getting very little new investment. The population is in deep trouble, some 50 to 60% living in poverty, and it's very hard to see the tunnel, never mind the light at the end of it, of how we make progress without a whole lot of things we're going to talk about in the next few minutes. I'll stop there.
And after those two very somber diagnoses, Mark, you recently wrote a column that flies in the face of what we've constantly been told is the view of the average middle-aged white man in South Africa. Can you tell the audience why you see a positive future in South Africa?
Well, it'll start with you calling me middle-aged. I mean, that's a plus. I mean, one of the reasons I love staying here is because I haven't got choice. You know, when you get to like the third line on the application form for the investment visa in Portugal, they go, "How old are you?" And they stop reading my application about that. And what medical ailments do you have? No, I mean, this is home, and it's nice to be amongst our people. We have locus standi. We have reasons to create vested interest and a future, which I wouldn't feel anywhere else in the world. So on a personal level, it's like that. I mean, the Blue Bulls thrashed the Stormers a week ago, and I'm still allowed into Cape Town. You know, go Blue Billa. And so, if you understand that. But despite the fact that, you know, the water reticulation is going to be our real downfall, you know, there are the 3 threes. You know, you can go 3 weeks without food, 3 days without water, and 3 minutes without oxygen. And there will come a time when in some small town, the trucks won't get there within 3 days. So we have, you know, that existential crisis which is going to make us gather. Despite all of these things, things function. I've just moved homes down here in Cape Town. And between the previous owner and myself, we forgot to pay the water bill. So I went on to technology and I did and that stuff, despite my age. And the minute I'd pressed pay, the water came on. I was literally holding the device, and there was the tap, and it went ding, ding, and it worked. So the economy is driving the system, okay, in some towns. If you were to go and spend an hour sitting in the middle of the busiest street in Alexandra and watching trade, you'd realize there is a future in trade. The people that are transacting person-to-person business there are borrowing money at 3% a month by discounting their debtors and their purchase orders. If you're still making money with an effective all-in borrowing cost of 50% in an inflation environment of 5%, then imagine how much money you'd make if we could get capital to you in the right form. And I think this existential crisis is going to gather us, not disperse us. I think we're going to hold hands. And if we do that, finally, then I think we will start finding ways around the blockages. Trevor made a very interesting observation about how we could use technology to track and trace things. We won't talk about parcels, but it's considered ill manners to speak about the dead. But we can. We can make all of these things, actually happen. So imagine that funding cost worked. And imagine if there was a sufficient weight of internal and external capital that was finally convinced of the risk-return equation because they got round the roadblocks. They started investing directly in projects, not through municipalities, not through tender systems, but because of the common sense and the net present value of the project at hand. Imagine if we cut a deal like Norway did with the North Sea oil, where they said, we don't know how to do this, but we've got the reserves. Do you guys want to come and mine it, and we'll take a profit share and we'll do it. They've been doing that for, I don't know, I think it was an 80-year deal. Norway got rich. The people that know how to drill oil, and guess what? That's where tax revenue comes from. So I think we're going to find ourselves in a series of brand new solutions, ones that we all sort of reach out for but never reach because there's a trust deficit, there's an inferiority complex sitting across the table from a superiority complex, there's a past sitting across the table from a future, and all of the people in charge are too damn old.
And I think, as an optimist, I have to say, I think this gathering is one of the starting points for that.
We need a 45-year-old president. and maybe we're just in enough trouble for that to happen. I mean, if you look at some of the most successful presidents around the world, they were sort of below 50 years old. Why are they successful? Because they had more of a future than a past.
Yes. So we've got to read.
It's kind of difficult to invest in 20-year infrastructure development projects when you're only going to be around for 3. I mean, you may as well. So I'm staying here. Why? Because I want to be part of that. When we get to the bottom, I want to be there so that I can help climb to the top. And 2 more seconds. Africa is the undiscovered opportunity. We no longer need to think about countries and jurisdictions and geographies and stuff like that. We need to think about the individual. The individual is at the center of all economic debate and all data. And you can get to all of the individuals, 1.5 billion, there's damn it, of them in Africa, where the average growth in GDP is 4%. We bring that down quite a bit. So, yeah, I'm staying here, man. And I know the people here already. What?
So, talking about the individual and economics, we have a reader question from Greg Becker. Iraj, I'm going to give it to you. He says 1 million people have just left the education section. They're joining the workforce, and even with the jobs creation thing, we really don't have enough jobs for them. What do you think the unemployment rate is going to look like in 2029?
I think unemployment in South Africa, and I've said this before, many others have said, used to be a South African unemployability problem. It's not unemployment problem. And that's a very important distinction. Our human resource training, meaning schools, preschools, universities, colleges, are just out of it. They're looking backwards, not forwards. What comes out of those institutions, of that human resource development process, is no longer fit for purpose. Not because at the same time that we have this massive unemployment in South Africa, I can assure you, even in an economy that is growing less than 0.5%, many of our sectors are short of skills. You can walk to any sector of the economy. Their complaint is, yes, the government doesn't know what growth is, what they don't do, etc., etc. Yes, energy, yes, yes, yes. But I'm also short of engineers. I'm short of IT people. I'm short of technicians. We are short of plumbers. We are short of every skills that requires running the economy. So we have confused skills with certification. We think somebody has got a degree, therefore they can fit. And really, this is an issue that needs to be discussed as parents, as activists in the society. We need to understand that the age of certification is gone. The same way that the age of titles has gone. For example, the title of minister, deputy minister, honorable MPs, are they honorable? They are a bunch of thieves. So we begin to question those titles. We got to question those certificates. Having a metric, a degree of whatever, if it does not translate to ability to participate in the economy of 21st century, call it fourth industrial revolution, fifth industrial, whatever title you want to give it, and soon AI. So all of that is a problem. Because those, including ourselves as a society, we are still looking for certification, not for capability, expertise, and ability to do things. And therefore, we do a couple of wrong things. We end up putting in our institutions, and by that I mean particularly tertiary educations, blind leading the blind. Professors who are there, they're training who? They're training people the best that they know, but what comes out of it cannot find a job. So that's the issue that we need to deal with it. And of course, I must also say we have a severe case, a chronic case of it, because for 20 years we haven't been listening to this type of advice that's not coming from me, from a lot of specialists, a lot of business people. But increasingly now other countries have the same problem, because there is a mismatch between the rate at which human resource development can cope with the change in technology and change of methodology of production. And there we have, therefore, a global problem. We have countries even like China suddenly has got unemployment of youth problem. We have just about every emerging economy exactly the same problem that we have. Of course, as I mentioned, and it's important not to diminish it, that we have a severe case, possibly globally number one right at the bottom, because those in charge, they cannot understand, and it may be partly related to the point that Mark raised, that our so-called ministers and deputy ministers and MPs and so on, they've overstayed their presence by 30 to 40 years. And therefore, they cannot relate to the reality of the economy the same way that I don't relate, quite frankly, because I'm part of that same generation. I can't cope with the change of technology. Whenever I get a new phone, I have to get my daughter to sit down 4 or 5 days and shout at me and say, "What is it that you don't understand?" I said, "Well, I don't, because I was trained in a different era." I challenge all of us to get, and this was, in my view, in the new election, one of the requirements of the political parties should have, before they put them on the list, is, can you operate a modern cell phone? If you're not, you don't qualify, because you don't know what's happening in the world. That leads to unemployment.
You say it when it's
Can
a
I
joke,
come into
but-
that discussion?
Yes, go for it.
So I agree with almost everything that Raj said, except his opening statement. I think it's a cop-out to only talk about skilled people. We have millions and millions of workers who, through no fault of their own, have not got good education and didn't go to a decent school or tertiary education, and they need work. Now, what South Africa's done since 1994 is to pretend that we have a skilled workforce and we want to pay them well. But that ignores the route to inclusion and prosperity that almost every country in the world that hasn't discovered oil has taken. So we have millions of people who need unskilled jobs today. And people who talk about the fourth industrial revolution ignore the reality of those people, because in most cases, I'm not necessarily a Raj, but in most cases, they don't want to deal with the facts of our approach to employment, which is that we don't really want the low-skilled factories that are driving inclusion in Vietnam, in Laos, in Bangladesh, in China a few years ago, and elsewhere. Now, there is enormous potential for a window, maybe 10 years or a bit more, to go the route for many people of unskilled labor in factories. Now, lots of people like to say this is sweatshop labor, and that's absolute nonsense. There is no other way out for people with limited or no skills and no work experience. It's not a snapshot. You get a job in a factory making a t-shirt. You learn the discipline of work. You learn all sorts of things, and you eye the next person who's a little bit up on the ladder, making Erasa's shirt a more complicated operation, or managing people doing that. And you can get ahead. And that's the way you have to get ahead. And people want to avoid the political choices of doing that. So I'm in favor of skills, and there are all sorts of things we can talk about in terms of our skill system, but I'm not in favor of ignoring the millions and millions of people who want a job today. And in the words of Paul Romer, Nobel Prize winner, your first job in a factory can be a second chance at school. And South Africa has said, not good enough. We think unless you get a decent wage, you shouldn't get a job. Well, I think a first step and any job is a much better proposition than no jobs at all.
So we've got questions coming through thick and fast from the audience. Sukasha says for Anne or Mark, or both, you both have painted a grim but accurate picture about the problems our country faces. What can the average person do to help? Can we do anything? What are the solutions? And you've talked about a polycrisis. Can you unpack that for us? I mean, we all know about Eskom and Transnet, but that's not the end all and be all.
I'll be very quick in answer to your first question. What can the average person do? You should vote, and vote differently. Vote for a better government. In terms of the polycrisis, where do I start? We all know about energy, which affects all of us, but affects small businesses and the poor much more. What about the ports that the government can't run, that Transnet can't run, or the railways? How about passenger rail? About 5 years ago, it was something like 500 million passenger journeys a year. Last year, we're down to 20 million. We are deindustrializing as a society, as an economy. And it's important to understand the consequences of that. Unemployment, probably one of the highest in the world.
So,
Poverty is 50 to 60% of the population. So a country that came, 1994, we said we were going to empower black South Africans who had had such a raw deal under apartheid and before that. This government has immiserated the population, not empowered anyone other than a tiny elite who's been enriched. So I could go on, but I'll let Mark take over.
Well, thank you, Anne. I think the problem will be solved by ordinary people. I think the solution to South Africa is bottom up, not top down, because you've tried that, right? Okay, and so I think we have to start talking about incremental, measurable, observable change rather than grand schemes. I think we have to talk about how many little things have you done that made a small difference, and technology can enable all of that interface and everything. But I'd go further. I'd say something much worse and perhaps controversial. I wonder if the government isn't looking for a dependent population. Okay. You almost get the sense that it's not independent individuals that we're nurturing and growing and promoting here. It's a need to dominate, a need to suppress, a need to create dependence. And what happens in that kind of society is that failure becomes a refuge, a crowded place where we all gather and fail together. And no one does their homework, because if you're the one that does, you're the bad guy. Okay? And so I think we have to devolve power, and we have to take business to the people. And I think I'd like to talk about a thing called, let's call it local economic empowerment, where you bring business to where people can easily access it. So I think we are going to be the sum of the individuals, not the consequence of the leaders.
And then this year globally is the year of elections. We've got voters taking to the poll in more than 60 countries worldwide. What does that look like for local and economic stock markets? And if you were giving government direct policy recommendations on increasing foreign direct investment, what would you say?
Look, the order of magnitude roughly is about 2.5 billion of Earth's population are going through election this year. And our 60 million is in that context. Countries like India, the United States, some insignificant countries like UK and so on are also getting into that. So in terms of population, that is not in terms. It's a very critical role. The second point to recognize is the point that I think Mark mentioned. Somehow, curiously, those who stand for election in this 2.3 billion, all the leaders are above 70 and close to 100, so years of old. So they soon will be carried electioneering in wheelchairs, but I emphasize this because their thinking is backwards. Their ambitions are also looking to the last century in terms of what can be done, should be done, which affects the flows of investment. At the moment, in terms of latest numbers that I looked at about 4 or 5 days ago, it's the first time in past 50 years, in terms of volume of cash held by fund managers and by corporates, in euro, in dollar, in yen, in every currency of your choice, including China. What does that tell us? There is no shortage of money. There is no shortage of funds. There is no shortage of, at the same time, investable opportunities. Look at South Africa. All the problems that we mentioned here, rail, port, water, urban infrastructure, these are quite frankly, believe it or not, from an investment point of view, opportunities for using the funds. So why are the cash held in that way? On every continent, on every country, not just emerging economies, even the United States, even UK, Germany, France, Japan, etc., etc. So the funds are waiting because they don't know what's going to happen. So when and if any of these countries that are going into election, if they come out with a government that is half credible, doesn't have to be 100%, half credible, there is no shortage of foreign direct investments. But we need two very important requirements. One is that we need to have a credibility of political process. Governments that are with it, they understand it, and they can move at the speed of fourth industrial revolution, not at the speed of 20th century. And that, I've had the privilege of talking to some ministers. Quite frankly, they don't understand it. And I've told them in their faces, and I've told them publicly here. They do not understand the importance of time in attracting investment. The second thing that we need is to have the right infrastructure. The countries that they do, they will attract more of that foreign direct investment. So I don't think we should talk ourselves to depression that there is no funds and there is shortage of capital. None of that. The opposite. The problem starts at home. And I'm on record to say that if I was playing God 1 week in South Africa, without ministers and others getting in the way, we could get more than 60% of our problems solved and financed within a week. And I'm prepared to bet on it. At the moment, the only country that is half, not more than half, in fact, quite successful, relatively speaking, is India. India is attracting a great deal of infrastructure funding, private sector funding, technology funding, you name it, they get it. Why? Because they fulfill those two requirements. The government has become credible and pro-investment, locally and internationally, and secondly, they are upgrading their infrastructure, be it port, rail, energy, etc., etc. So I think the year ahead of us is a very exciting year, because some countries will emerge and others will submerge. You can hold me to that. Those who will still want to move at the pace of the last century because of their old leadership, they're going to submerge, because there isn't a static position. There isn't a way to stay where we are. You either go forward, and if you don't rest 100% assured, you're going backwards. That is the game of foreign direct investment at the moment.
And the finance minister was quite bullish in his recent budget speech on the feasibility of public-private partnerships, signaling that government has finally acknowledged that actually they don't know what they're doing and they need help. Isn't that signaling opportunity, and shouldn't that be boosting confidence in the business sector and possibly even driving foreign direct investment?
Yeah, ignorance, they say, is bliss, but you can continue.
Well, we've been talking about public-private investment and getting more investment since this president came into power. Yes, they have gazetted new regulations on public-private partnerships. I haven't read them yet, but I think back on the experience in terms of infrastructure, which you'll all recall was the predominant sort of magic bullet that was going to get the economy growing in the first 5 years of President Ramaphosa's administration. Well, we didn't get much happening. There were almost no public-private investments in infrastructure. So I'm not so worried about the Treasury. I think the Treasury is one of the few remaining competent departments in South Africa. I'm worried about attitudes to the private sector and an understanding of how the private sector works. And what's required, to answer your big question, what's required, hopefully, post this election, is a government that will understand the power of markets and firms and enable them to do the maximum they can do in the country with appropriate regulation. And what we need is a government that administers South Africa, that governs South Africa in the interests of all of us and not in the interests of one political party. And essentially, we need people, the right people appointed to positions who work hard and who don't steal our money.
I think the government's got a simple choice. Do they want to have a share of profits or 100% of losses? It's a difficult choice, I admit, particularly when you're trying to downplay the population. So there's a huge role for the state, and there's a huge need for them to connect the dots between developmental and commercially sustainable mandates, because both are required. And so I don't support privatization willy-nilly, because it will solve things, but for how many people? How many people can afford an overnight courier? Maybe 3% of the population. So, outright privatization is not the answer. We've got to go through the difficult machinations of getting to understand one another's logics before we can co-design an ecosystem that tolerates both. Now, ideology can be a huge problem, a huge block for that. If your point of departure is not capitalism but socialism, then to quote Maggie Thatcher, the trouble with socialists is they soon run out of other people's money. And so we need, as a foundation for transformation, as a foundation for coming together, we need commercial validity and reality. We will not transform, we will not share, there will be nothing to share unless at the outset we have a commercially sustainable growing economy. But it's going to take a new understanding and almost a control alternate delete of the mindsets that prevail in these debates. I've been to one or two of these economic imbisos where the acquiescent CEOs of South Africa all go to kowtow to the ruling speech. That's not what we're talking about. And by the way, they don't own the capital. The real owners of capital have choice. We have to invite them, and we have to make this a risk-return equation which balances. Oh, they're not coming. They're not old-aged.
Sorry, so we've actually run out of time, but I'm going to give you each 1 minute to talk about whether a coalition government, which is looking increasingly likely, is the way forward for business in this country.
I think my view is that this partnership, private-public sector partnership, has got a lot of potential, but we haven't done it. SAA collapsed today again. So because the minister doesn't understand, the cabinet doesn't understand, even when they approve, they don't understand what they're approving, and that's a problem. And we need to be really getting serious about governance. I sometimes feel that political parties, all of them, not just ANC, ANC has fallen to the bottom, but even others, they are playing games. They don't understand how the economy works. So we have a huge opportunity to turn the economy around. Fortunately, the economy is resourceful, and we need to use it to build the economy. We cannot talk ourselves to depression through criticism. Criticism is not going to rebuild the economy. Actions, competent actions, timely actions is going to do it, and that's what, as citizens, we need to push for.
And I don't think he's endorsing the Action Party, but Anne?
Well, South Africa faces very difficult choices ahead. If we get a coalition government, they need to appoint the best people in the country to the cabinet. That's going to be essential. The quality of leadership in the cabinet, the top senior officials, that's going to be not quite the beginning and the end, but that's going to really matter. We need competent people of integrity who want to govern in the national interest. That's the first point. The second is you're going to have to make the right decisions. And that will be hard in a coalition government, but they're decisions that are clear about where South Africa has strengths. The state is collapsing around us at national level. So you can't say, I want them to do all the following things tomorrow, because they won't be reconstructed. So you have to accept the reality of a very weak and corrupt state in the main, not everybody. And then you have to say what works in South Africa. And the politicians are going to have to build on what works. That's key parts of the economy run through markets where we need much more competition and we need to be more competitive globally. And you've got to look at who and what in civil society can help provide the capacities that we need. So I'm looking for a certain kind of coalition, ideally, rather than the other option. There is a really catastrophic coalition that would change this conversation altogether.
Mark, can I ask you to wrap up before security comes to drag us off the
coalitions will not work for so long as they're focusing on each other instead of the problem. Okay. In every discussion I've had with politicians, you sit down to talk about Johannesburg and they talk about each other. Okay, so it's, well, what about those guys doing this and what about, unless we, unless we change our uniforms, don't bring your uniform to school. Let's all wear the same color just once and try and focus on the problem. So we're going to have a coalition of some sorts, whether it's obvious or behind the scenes. I can tell you we're going to have a coalition, because I don't think there's going to be an outright majority. I don't think there's going to be a big change in government. I think the 2%ers will gather and they'll make a contribution to that coalition. But I'm not a politician. But the only point I make is, can we all focus on the problem instead of looking at criticizing and complaining each other, because that doesn't drive strategy. That just drives whinging. I really fell asleep saying that.
Thank you very much.